so much for joining us today. I'm John Ewing, the creator of Aero and today we're going to talk about a topic that matters right now, both to Part 135 operators and, of course, Part 145 repair stations. That topic is Safety Management Systems, or SMS. This webinar is built around one core idea. SMS is not just a buzzword, and it is not just a paperwork project. It's becoming the defining management system across aviation in the United States. For many Part 135 operators, the FAA now requires SMS, with implementation deadlines on May 28th of next year for almost all operators. For Part 145 repair stations, the FAA continues to include them in the SMS voluntary program, and the FAA specifically says that formal SMS can improve safety, communication, decision-making, customer confidence, contract eligibility, and recruiting and retention. There's no direct timeline for mandatory SMS compliance in Part 145, but last year, they were quoted stating that the FAA is actively evaluating SMS for additional certificate holders. It seems clear that it's not a matter of if, but really when they're going to end up requiring it across the board. Of course, for US Part 145 repair stations with EASA approval, that's EU's version of the FAA, this topic is even more immediate because the 2025 deadlines have already passed, and the focus now is on proving that SMS is actually working in your operation. I'm joined today by two thought leaders in 145 and 135 operations. First up will be Netta Ragland, my partner and a board-certified aviation lawyer. She'll help us work through the legal, accountability, and leadership side of SMS implementation. And second, Sean Englam, an aviation organizational authority, will walk us through how to build a system that actually works in real operations without creating chaos or making you want to drink Jet A fuel. Let me start with Let me start with the most important issues of the day. A lot of people hear SMS and they think headaches, paperwork, manuals, meetings, and one more system to feed. That's the wrong way to look at this. If you build it badly, sure, it's going to be a disaster. But if you build it right, SMS becomes something that will make your operation better, period. It helps operations identify hazards upstream, it makes better decisions for your entire operation, and it improves comps between the departments. The FAA defines SMS as, quote, the formal top-down organization-wide approach to managing safety risk and assuring the effectiveness of safety risk controls. That's a mouthful. It will make solid operations even better. And the FAA has been very direct about the intent behind this shift. FAA Administrator Mike Whitaker sums this up very clearly when he recently said, quote, requiring aviation organizations to implement a proactive approach to management safety will do one thing: it will save lives. That statement matters because it shows how the FAA is actually thinking. This is not about waiting for the event, the finding, or the failure. It's about better systems upstream to avoid safety issues downstream. The FAA's SMS materials describe SMS as a structured, repeatable, systematic approach to identify hazards and manage safety risk. That's the standard for both audiences. Even though the regulatory posture is going to obviously be different for Part 135 and Part 145, the posture is the same. And I want to make one distinction right away. For Part 135, the question is no longer whether the SMS matters. The question is, how well are you going to implement this? For Part 145 repair stations, especially non-EASA certified repair stations, the question is less about an immediate FAA mandate and more about whether you want to use SMS as a real operational advantage. Beginning the process while it is still voluntary will give you a clear advantage once the FAA requires it in the coming years. And for EASA-approved repair stations, the question is much more close to, can you demonstrate compliance right now, today? That's why this webinar has to speak to both strategy and execution. The FAA also says that SMS is all about safety decision-making throughout the organization, and that it should be a decision-maker's tool, not a traditional safety program separate from operational decision-making. That applies beautifully to both flight operations and repair stations. So what does this mean in plain English? It means SMS should influence how a Part 135 operator thinks about fatigue, dispatch, training, route risk, maintenance coordination, and comms. And it means SMS should influence how 145 thinks about hazard reporting, process drift, internal audits, training records, safety promotion, risk review, and whether documented procedures actually match what people are really doing within your operation. In the NBAA article that came out a few months ago on EASA-approved repair stations, the author, Amanda Ferraro, said that repair stations need to be ready to demonstrate, quote, clear, organized, and current evidence of SMS implementation, not just intent. That's a good standard for everyone in this conversation, not just EASA shops. This is where I want to bring in the first outside quote of the day from Jim Collins, whose work on leadership and implementation of new systems, is hugely respected throughout the industry. He says, quote, first, get the right people, and then figure out what to do. In an SMS context, I would change that up just a little bit. Get the right leadership, meaning the right people in the right seats. Then build the system. If you don't have the right leadership, you'll end up checking off boxes and with a system that is not nearly as good as it really could be. The FAA also makes another point that matters a lot here. SMS can be scaled to the size, scope, and complexity of every single operation. And the FAA's view is straightforward. Safety-centered systems are not optional anymore. They're what produce consistent, compliant, and safe results. That matters a lot. From single pilot and command operations to mid-sized Part 135s that are 9 or less, you don't need to imitate NetJets. In smaller repair stations, you don't need to imitate standard Aero. In fact, that would be a mistake. You need a system that is right-sized, usable, and real. At the core, SMS is trying to create a structure where people can raise hazard leaders that can evaluate risk. The organization can put controls in place, and then operation can verify whether those controls are actually working. And it does that through 4 core components: safety policy, safety risk management, safety assurance, and finally, safety promotion. Safety policy means leadership, commitment, accountability, and clarity. Safety risk management means identifying hazards and assessing and controlling the risk as it happens. Safety assurance means checking whether the systems are actually working. Safety promotion means communication, training, and reinforcing the culture that makes the whole system work, and of course, more importantly, work right. That framework comes straight from the FAA's SMS materials, and it applies to both 135 and 145 operations. But where organizations struggle is not usually with the definitions, it's with execution. They know the terms, but they don't know how to make those terms work inside their actual operation. And this is where I'm going to botch his name, Patrick Lencioni, says the following, quote, the single greatest advantage of any company can achieve is organizational health. That matters here because SMS done correctly is one expression of organizational health. It creates clarity, it creates consistency, it creates trust in process, and of course, less confusion about how risks get identified, escalated, reviewed, and ultimately closed out. That's the new floor. Now, let's talk about what the wrong approach looks like. The wrong approach is to treat SMS as a giant checklist project. The wrong approach is to buy a template, swap out names, assign someone to own safety, and presto, you now have SMS. The wrong approach is also to think reporting alone equals SMS. It simply doesn't. Reporting is one input. SMS is a closed loop management system, and the wrong approach is to overbuild too fast and too early. Too many forms, too many committees, too many vague labels, and too many abstract discussions will quickly teach employees that the system is just a bunch of noise. You can't have that. And that brings me to the organizational author Simon Sinek, who recently wrote, quote, customers should never be the priority of an operation. People should be the priority. In aviation, that does not mean the customer doesn't matter, obviously. It means that your system has to work for the people doing the work. If your crews, your schedulers, your techs, your inspectors, your supers, your managers experience SMS only as theoretical, they will comply outwardly and disengage inwardly. That kills the system. At this point, I'm excited to bring Netta Ragland in because this is where the legal and accountability and leadership dimensions of SMS become very important. Netta?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. And this is exactly where a lot of organizations underestimate the issue. because they think if they write the manual and assign the responsibility, they've done what they need to handle SMS. But from a legal and organizational standpoint, that's just not enough. A system like this only works if the leadership is real. If the accountable executive is not actually engaged, if responsibilities are blurry, or if reporting channels are unclear, or if managers treat the process inconsistently, then the organization is setting itself up for frustration at best, and then at worst, exposure. So it could be a very detrimental issue if it's not done correctly. So that is particularly true for Part 135 operators under the FAA mandate that we're talking about today. And it's also true for Part 145 repair stations trying to build a credible system, especially those who have the EASA approval, where evidence of implementation is what matters. So one of the most important things to understand is that SMS is not just about having the right words on paper. It's about creating a system, a culture that people can use consistently and leadership can apply, and leadership can stand on from a credible standpoint. And this is where leadership behavior matters. If leaders do not want to hear bad news early, the system dies. If the managers make people feel like reporting concerns is disloyal, the system dies. If people think the process is only there to create paperwork and assign blame after the fact, then the system dies. And that's not what the SMS is about. So there's this old line from Herb Keller that I think really is important here. He said, your people come first, and if you treat them right, they'll treat your customers right. So it kind of translates from one to the other. That matters because proactive systems depend on people telling the truth early and not staying quiet until the issue gets bigger if they have a fear of disclosing those issues. There's another quote that actually fits perfectly here from Don Clifton. John Clifton works with management teams and focuses his practice on strengths-based training. He says that what would happen if we studied what was right with people versus what's wrong with people? And that really should be the focus. So in an SMS environment, that matters because the best systems are not built around blame. They're actually built around visibility, learning, and better performance. So accountability matters, but a blame-based system usually produces silence and silence is the enemy of good SMS. It's counterproductive to SMS. So from a legal and leadership standpoint, here are the questions that I would want all operators, all repair stations to ask when it comes to SMS. The first question is, do people know how to report a concern? The second question is, do they know what qualifies as a hazard or reportable issue? Third question is, do they know who sees it? Fourth is, do they know what happens next? And then finally, do they believe that something constructive will happen when they raise the concern instead of just receiving disciplinary action? And to that last question, if the answer is no, then the organization, if the answer to any of those questions is no, then the organization doesn't really have an SMS culture. So what it has instead of an SMS culture is a document structure without real trust underneath it, which isn't going to be very helpful for the company. This is also where the legal side and the organizational side come together. A weak SMS is often a symptom of weak internal clarity, and weak internal clarity shows up everywhere. You're going to see it all over your organization. It shows up in escalation failures, inconsistent documentation, confusion over who owns what, and poor follow through. That's why Patrick Lencioni's point about organizational health is so useful. When he says that organizational health is the company's greatest advantage, that applies directly to SMS. Does the organization communicate clearly? Does it escalate effectively? Does it learn honestly? Does it apply standards consistently? Those are not just abstract, thoughts and questions. They're operational questions and things that operators and repair stations really need to sit down and address. So I also wanted to caution both audiences against building a reporting system that feels like a black hole. If employees submit concerns or report an issue and they never hear back about it, then they stop using the system because it ends up to them feeling like it's just being thrown into a black hole. If they only hear back when there's, alternatively, if they only hear back when there's disciplinary risk, then they stop trusting the system altogether. So if managers respond differently depending on who is involved, the system loses credibility. You have to kind of keep consistent follow through throughout. So that that an overall follow through has to happen from the get go. So consistency is not optional. Feedback's not optional. These are things that operators and repair stations should really address when there are reporting from their employees. This is where Simon Sinek's quote comes back into play. If the internal system does not work for the people using it, it will eventually fail the business altogether. So, what should leadership be doing now? Well, first, define ownership clearly. I think we're going to go to the next. Okay, there we go. First, define ownership clearly. Second, define the reporting path clearly. Third, define how elevated risks get reviewed. Fourth, you want to be clear on how the organization will verify whether mitigation worked. And then fifth, communicate all of that in plain language. So the FAA's own framing is very practical. SMS is all about safety decision making throughout the organization. If the system improves decision making, then it's working. If it creates paperwork without better decisions, then it's really not doing what it's supposed to. One more important point here before I hand this over to Sean is that both operators and repair stations should resist the temptation to overbuild early. And John kind of touched on this a little earlier in this presentation. But basically, bigger is not better. More forms are not better. More committees are not better. Better is better. And what that means is a right-sized, usable, well-understood system is going to be far more usable and defensible and more effective for your company than an overbuilt system that nobody trusts and a few people use correctly. So you want to make the system kind of work for your organization, your size, how it's going to work internally with your team. So from that, thank you all for listening, and I'm going to hand it over to Sean.
Thanks, Netta. Let's get practical. So if John's section was about what SMS is and why it matters, and Netta's section was about leadership, ownership, and credibility, my section is about how to build one without making your team miserable. The first thing I would tell any Part 135 operator or Part 145 repair station is this. Don't start with the manual, start with the workflow. Start with how hazards get seen, how concerns get raised, who evaluates them, how decisions get documented, and how leadership verifies whether the fix worked. The documentation matters, but if the underlying workflow is weak, the manual will just become a nicer description of a weak system. And this is where the FAA framework is useful. Safety policy, safety risk management, safety assurance, and safety promotion are not four separate departments. They're actually four connected functions. Policy sets expectation and accountabilities. Risk management turns observations into decisions. Assurance checks whether those decisions worked. And promotion keeps the system alive through communication and training. What ends up creating chaos is when organizations build those out of sequence. For example, if you encourage broad reporting without clear assessment and response logic, you're going to create noise. If you add committees before role clarity, you create meetings without traction. And if you announce a strong safety culture message, but managers still push bad news informally, you're creating distrust. So here's the sequence we recommend for both audiences. First, define leadership ownership. Who is accountable? Who manages the day-to-day administration? Who reviews elevated risk? Who owns follow-up? Second, define the reporting path. How does a pilot, scheduler, technician, inspector, or manager raise a concern? What qualifies as a report? What happens after the report? Third, define your risk review process. How do you assess likelihood, severity, and control effectiveness? Who has authority to accept a risk? When does something escalate? Fourth, define your assurance process. How do you know a mitigation actually worked? Fifth, define your promotion plan. How will you train on SMS? How will you communicate changes? How will you give people feedback so they know the system is active and worth using? Now, I want to pause on reporting because this is where a lot of organizations think they are building SMS when they are really just collecting anecdotes. A reporting system is only useful if people believe three things. One, leadership wants the truth. Two, something will happen with the information. And three, using the system will not punish them for being candid. This is why culture matters so much. The FAA's materials emphasize proactive hazard identification and risk management, and its safety culture work emphasizes what happens when safety competes with other demands. And this is the test, not what leadership says at the meeting. What does the organization do when safety competes with schedule, cost, convenience, or ego? That's also why I like another Patrick Lencioni line. If you get all the people in an organization rowing in the same direction, you could dominate any industry in any market against any competition at any time. SMS is one of the clearest ways to see whether an aviation organization is rowing in the same direction. If flight operations, maintenance, dispatch, scheduling, training, or shop leadership all define risk differently and escalate concerns differently, you don't have an aligned system. You have pockets of judgment. So how do you avoid that? Shared definitions, a common reporting language, clear thresholds for escalation, manager training, and follow through that looks the same every single time. Now let's talk about hazard identification. A lot of people hear hazard identification and immediately think catastrophic events. That's just too narrow. Hazards often show up first as recurring friction. And in Part 135, that might be fatigue pressure, dispatch handoff problems, route expansion, communication breakdowns, or training gaps. And in Part 145, that might be process drift, rushed decision making, documentation inconsistencies, vendor issues, internal audit findings, or maintenance delays that create pressure downstream. The FAA says SMS helps organizations adapt to change, increasing complexity and limited resources. That line matters because both growing operators and growing repair stations live in exactly that environment. Now, moving on to risk management, this is where organizations often overcomplicate things. Your risk assessment process does not need to sound academic. It needs to help the right people make the right decision in time. That means asking, what is the hazard? What is the exposure? What is the severity if this goes wrong? What controls exist or are in place now? Are those controls actually reliable? And what additional mitigation is needed? Then somebody needs authority to make the decision. And that authority needs boundaries. In SMS terms, that means if nobody knows who owns the review, who approves the mitigation, who monitors effectiveness, or when to elevate an issue, accountability will erode pretty fast. Then comes safety assurance, which is where a lot of systems can get lazy. Organizations put real effort into identifying a problem and proposing a fix, and then they move on. But assurance asks the most important question. Did the fix actually work? Did recurrence drop? Did the workaround stop? Did employees understand the change? Did the revised process survive real operating conditions? The FAA says SMS provides increased confidence in risk controls through structured safety assurance processes. That is the point. Not faith in the fix, but confidence in the fix because the organization actually checked. And on to safety promotion. This is the part many organizations underestimate because they think once the structure exists, people will just use it. And they won't. They need context, they need training, repetition, examples, and feedback. And that brings me to W. Edwards Deming, who said, quality does not just happen, it is built in. That applies directly to SMS. Proactive safety culture does not appear because you published a manual. It is built in through repetition, coaching, review, and leadership behavior over time. Now, I want to give you a practical implementation path that works for both audiences. Phase one is architecture. Identify leadership roles, define the reporting channel, define the review workflow, define risk thresholds, define record keeping expectations, and the communication plan. Phase two is pilot use. Start using the systems on real issues. Don't wait for perfection. And moving on to phase three, calibration. What is confusing? What is slow? Where are reports getting stuck? Phase four, integration. Build SMS into leadership meetings, operational changes, training cycles, manual updates, vendor reviews, and post-event learning. Phase five is maturity. Now you're using trend data, validating control effectiveness, making the system part of how the company learns. And I want to be clear, SMS should not make your operation slower by default. The FAA says formal SMS can produce benefits like proactive problem solving, cost savings, better data-informed decision-making, enhanced communication, stronger safety culture, increased customer confidence, and greater eligibility for some contracts. If your system is only adding administrative drag, something with the design is off. Now let's talk about the most common mistakes, right? So delegating SMS downward and disappearing upward, building the manual before the workflow, overcomplicating the structure, failure to close the loop, confusing a reporting culture with a learning culture, trying to bolt SMS onto an unhealthy organization without fixing the leadership behavior underneath it. And that last one's a big one. With that, let me hand it back to John to close.
Thanks, Sean. You nailed that issue exactly. You can't duct tape SMS onto a bad system. It will fail every time. Usually the right answer is disciplined, right-sized implementation with clear ownership and steady follow-through. And let me leave you with a few final 135 operators and an increasingly valuable operating reality for 145 repair stations, especially those in the FAA voluntary program or with EASA approval. Second, the best organizations will use SMS as more than a mandate. They will use it as a way to build a stronger system, better reporting, better visibility, better learning, better discipline during growth. Now, third, do not miss the leadership point. The system will tell the truth about your culture. I will tell you whether managers actually listen, whether people trust escalation channels, whether departments coordinate well, and whether leadership is serious about learning before the next event. That's why I want to close with two final quotes. One is from Herb Kelleher, the famous Herb Kelleher. Your people come first, and if you treat them right, they'll treat the customers right. Nothing could be more true. And SMS works when people believe in the leadership. They want the truth and will use it well. The other is from the FAA itself. Quote, SMS is all about safety decision-making throughout the organization. That's your key takeaway. If your SMS improves decision-making throughout the organization, you're building it the right way. If it only produces paperwork, you're not done yet. In fact, you've barely started. Now, let me connect this to something we built for operators and repair stations that want a more proactive operating structure overall, and that is the AeroShield legal program. AeroShield is Aero Law Center's subscription-based legal platform built specifically for Part 135 operators and Part 145 repair stations. It's designed to help organizations stop treating legal as a surprise expense or a last-minute emergency response. Instead, it brings proactive legal and regulatory support into the day-to-day life of the business. That includes strategic guidance, operational support, recurring check-ins, and team-wide education designed to help organizations stay ahead of the curve as they grow and stay ahead of risk. And that fits this conversation because strong SMS implementation depends on clarity. It depends on consistency and accountability and, of course, leadership. AeroShield supports that kind of discipline. It also gives organizations something many of them badly need, which is predictability, predictable legal spend, predictable access to aviation counsel, and a better way to handle growth, compliance, and internal decision-making without constantly wondering whether the next legal issue is going to become an urgent emergency or something causing an issue with the FAA. So if you are serious about building a more proactive operation, a better operation, strengthening your compliance posture, and supporting smarter growth, this is a very good time to talk with us about AeroShield. There are 3 subscription tiers starting at just $9.50 a month. They include prepaid legal that rolls over month to month, 1, 2, or 3 hours depending on the tier. This is the only program of its kind in the entire world, and it is saving most of our clients $7,000 to $8,000 a year. It's about predictable legal spending. For those of you that decide to sign up for AeroShield or even just to do a consultation for us today, we will upgrade you from the gold tier to the platinum tier. That's a $10,000 value. Think of AeroShield as having your own in-house board-certified aviation attorney, but not having to pay $300,000 to $400,000 a year to have that employee. We're there for you. We're your co-pilot moving forward as you try to scale your 135 or 145 operation. Please reach out to Sean afterwards so he can sign you up and get this amazing savings. Okay, real quickly, back to SMS. Here is the practical next step. Go back to your organization and ask 5 questions. 1, do we have clear leadership, ownership? 2, do we have a practical risk review process? 3, do we verify whether mitigations actually work? And finally, do our people trust the system enough to use it honestly? If the answer to any of those questions is no, that's where the work starts. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. And if you want help through anything, please reach out to us. We'd love to work with you on your manuals, your leadership accountability, your implementation sequence, or whatever area, whether AeroShield or Aero Law Center, can help you with that makes sense for your business. We'd be glad to help you to think it through clearly and practically. And with that, I'd like to open it up. If anyone has any questions, we'd love to answer them. If not, it was wonderful spending this hour with everyone.
The Q&A is open, everybody. I just wanted to let you know. Feel free to come off mute, ask your questions. John and Netta are here to guide you through anything that you might have. We'll stick around for a few minutes. If you're having trouble unmute, feel free to send me a quick chat too.
Well, I want to thank everyone again for coming, and it was a pleasure spending this 45 minutes or so with you. And please reach out to us if you have any questions. We'd love to speak with you. Have a great day.